So I called my friend before us, Mark. I said, Mark, what the heck? You sent a rest in peace bouquet to my friend who nearly died of melanoma. And he was, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And I said, well, I'm sure it's no big deal, don't worry about it. It's not the end of the world. And he said, no, you don't understand. There were 2 deliveries that day. And if your friend got the one that said rest in peace, the one that went to the funeral said, good luck in your new location. Humor at a death and dying conference is always it's a good thing, right? So I'm not going to talk too much about Compassionate Choices of Washington. We've handed out brochures that talk about who we are and what we do. But I am the executive director of the Washington State affiliate of Compassionate Choices, and we were formed by the merger of what was the Hemlock Society of Washington and Compassion and Dying of Washington in 2005. And by the way, Compassion and Dying, half of the national organization Compassion and Choices, was founded in Seattle, Washington in 1993, following the 1991 initiative to try and pass a Death with Dignity Act that failed in Washington. And we're a nonprofit. We advocate for patients' rights, for expanding care at the end of life. We provide free client support services. We have 40 volunteers across the state of Washington that educate terminally ill people and incurably ill people, not just terminally ill people, about their end-of-life options, including the option of using the Death with Dignity Act. We also created the coalition that passed Initiative 1000, the Washington Death with Dignity Act, with nearly 60% of the vote. It was 2008, it was the Obama election. Turnout was going to be high. That was a strategic decision that was made. We also knew that the Catholic Church was going to be busy with trying to defeat the gay marriage initiative on the ballot in California. You'll see more about that later. The law also passed in 30 of Washington's 39 counties, so our victory was delicious. So it was wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about the Catholic Church. Now, there's a book that's edited by Tim Quill, a palliative care physician, and Peggy Batten, who's been here at this conference. And one chapter of that is by a man named Eli Stutzman, one of the heroes in the Death with Dignity movement in the United States. And it's essential reading for anyone considering the passage of a Death with Dignity Act or Death with Dignity legislation anywhere in the United States. And one of the things that Eli says is there's really only one opponent to Death with Dignity or aid in dying in the United States, and that opponent is the Catholic Church. Now, organized medicine is opposed to Death with Dignity, but they don't have the organization and the finances and the strategic power that the political arm of the Catholic Church has. Look at the amounts of money that the Church has raised and contributed to the opposition campaign since 1991. And now look at the year 2008, and notice how the amount dropped down to less than 50%. That's because the Church was pouring money into California to try to defeat the legalization of gay marriage. So lots of money. So this is the first way that the Catholic Church defies death with dignity, by trying and frequently succeeding in preventing the passage of legal aid and dying laws. So the Washington Death with Dignity Act, like all the Death with Dignity Acts in Washington, and it seems from what I hear about what's happening in Europe, is that it's an opt-in law, meaning that no physician can be compelled to participate. No pharmacist can be compelled to fill a prescription for life-ending medication. No psychologist or psychiatrist must confirm a patient's capacity to participate in the law. And it allows also providers, whole medical systems to opt out of providing so long as they notify the community about their policies. Obviously, Catholic providers have all opted out of participation in the Death with Dignity Act. That's not surprising. The statutory definition of participation, however, does not include referring patients and providing information, and the law is very clear about that. Another thing the law is very clear about is that death with dignity, or participating in the law, is not suicide. Suicide remains a class, assisting a suicide remains a Class C felony in Washington. So there's a very clear difference between the practice of assisting a suicide and death with dignity or aid in dying. And if you think about it for a moment, you don't want people with life insurance to be penalized because their death certificate says that they committed suicide. You want those life insurance policies, you want that death certificate to say that the cause of death is the underlying disease. And the law requires that in Washington. So what happens when the culture of life, the so-called culture of life, I should say, collides with the majority's choice of aid and dying? Not sure if you can read this, but it's 3 buildings under this banner culture of life. One says the Division of Electrocution and Lethal Injections. Another says the Division of Thwarting Advances in Medicine, and the other is the Division of War Making. It's incredible how many people who are opposed to death with dignity and aid in dying are also in favor of the death penalty, which, by the way, is involuntary euthanasia, which we strongly oppose as a movement, the idea that people are put to death against their wish. So the basis of Catholic opposition are the ethical and religious directives for healthcare. But before we get to that, I just want to read from the ethical and religious for healthcare, really sort of the defining statement when it comes to how Catholics, and the Catholic hierarchy, I should say. And let me be clear. When I'm talking here, we're talking about the policies of the Catholic hierarchy, not lay Catholics. In Washington, lay Catholics voted, half of them voted in favor of the Death with Dignity Act, according to exit polls in Washington. And virtually all of them approve of contraception. But the hierarchy of the church believes that we are not the owners of our lives, and hence do not have absolute power over life. We have a duty to preserve our life and to use it for the glory of God. But the duty to preserve life is not absolute, for we may reject life-prolonging procedures that are insufficiently beneficial or excessively burdensome. Suicide and euthanasia are never morally acceptable options. So you have to understand the church sees us as not in control of our lives, not having the power to decide to end our own lives. These ethical and religious directives were created and modified by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, currently in the 5th edition. The directives protect the truths of the Catholic Church as those truths are brought to bear on concrete issues in healthcare. They're subject to interpretation by local bishops. In some areas we have rather progressive bishops, and in some areas we have extremely conservative bishops. Since the last Pope was very active in promoting conservative bishops, we have currently in the United States, we're sort of burdened with a whole crop of new, very conservative bishops who are interpreting the ethical and religious directives in a very conservative way. It applies to sponsors, trustees, administrators, chaplains, physicians, pharmacists, everybody, including patients or residents of Catholic institutions or services, including hospitals, long-term care facilities. Now, the ethical and religious directives are actually some pretty good reading. There's a lot in there about the mystery of Christ, and for someone who's maybe not an atheist or agnostic, it might seem uninteresting, but there's also a lot of good in the ethical and religious directives. There's statements in there about social justice, around healthcare, around the provision of care, around charitable care. There's actually a lot of good in the directives. But unfortunately, from our perspective, the good is more than balanced, overbalanced by the bad. Not surprisingly, these ethical and religious directives get translated into policies that healthcare providers are required to follow. This is a brochure for the medical staff, and it addresses issues around conflict of interest and things like that. And I just excerpted the policy on ethical and religious directives. And note that it says we require adherence to all ethical and religious directives as a condition of medical privileges and employment. Now, this adherence can also be applied to physicians who have hospital privileges at Catholic facilities, and it can also apply to physicians and others who rent space or lease space in a Catholic-owned property. The reach of these directives is expansive. It's amazing how it permeates almost all levels of healthcare in healthcare institutions. So I wanted to actually let you know what some of the ethical and religious directives are. Obviously, euthanasia is an action or omission that of itself by intention causes death in order to alleviate suffering, and I've already said how the Catholic Church can't participate. But think about that. Euthanasia as an omission of care. Now, when I think about the omission of care, I think about stopping treatment. The choice of people to voluntarily stop treatment. That's the way most of us are going to die in this country. Someone, either us or a legal surrogate decision maker, is going to make a decision to terminate life support. Now, the church says that terminating life support or stopping treatment can actually be considered euthanasia. Now, I consider that to be allowing a natural death. So whenever you see the word omitted or omission in a document, like the popular advance directive called 5 Wishes, you know that there's a Catholic behind that document, a Catholic organization or a Catholic individual. 5 Wishes has a stealth statement in it about, I do not want anything omitted from my care that would result in my death. That reflects the Catholic ethical and religious directive. The second bullet here that says people in a persistent vegetative state, there's an obligation to continue nutrition and hydration to keep that person alive. This is sort of as a result of the Terry Shiloh situation. In that situation, the church felt that Terry Shiloh should continue to receive medically assisted nutrition and hydration, even though she was in a persistent vegetative state and would never recover from that. This one is rather medieval. Patients should be kept free of pain as possible, since the person has the right to prepare for his or her death while fully conscious. He or she may not be deprived of consciousness without a compelling reason. Patients experiencing suffering that cannot be alleviated should be helped to understand, or appreciate rather, the Christian understanding of redemptive suffering. Now, I work with people who work for Catholic providers in Washington, Providence, Franciscan, Peace Health, and they just cringe at this directive. It's, the idea that, that you could explain to someone who doesn't share your faith that, well, it's okay for you to suffer because we believe in redemptive suffering. I think that's rather offensive. Finally, this last one, which really concerns many people in Washington whose only choice for medical care is at a Catholic facility. Free and informed judgment made by a competent adult, or actually in another directive it says their legal surrogate decision maker, concerning the use of withdrawal of life-sustaining procedures should be always respected and normally complied with unless it is contrary to Catholic moral teaching. So this creates anxiety of the idea, well, will my living will my life choices be respected at a Catholic institution? And that's a fair question. A lot of it has to do with the local bishop, because if there's a controversy, the person that will actually decide is not a team of physicians. If it's controversial enough, it will be the bishop, who may not know anything about medical or end-of-life care. So that's a problem. In many places in Washington, the only place you can go to get care or emergency care if you happen to have a car accident when you're driving by is a Catholic facility. I'm not sure if you can see this, but it's your end-of-life wish is honored here with an asterisk, and the asterisk says, unless it's against our religious teaching. So how do Catholic providers defy the death with dignity in Washington? They prohibit the participation in death with dignity by physicians and other providers, and that's permitted by law. They adopt gag rules prohibiting the discussion of the option with patients, meaning they tell social workers, nurses, physicians, you're not allowed to talk about this. You can't give people information about this. Withhold information about the option of death with dignity. They prohibit referrals to organizations like Compassion and Choices, or they prohibit all referrals, or when they do make a referral, they refer to an organization that can't provide any meaningful assistance except a referral to Compassion and Choices of Washington, which some of them do. But that lets the church feel that they're not participating in death with dignity, so they don't give the person a direct referral, they give the referral to someone who will refer to us. And that's called reduction in complicity, which is a very important concept within the Catholic hierarchy as well. And these gag rules, these prohibitions on referrals, are actually enabled by federal and state refusal clauses. And note that I call them refusal clauses and not conscience clauses. I think it's important to call these things what they are. Now, in this country, these refusal clauses started in the early 70s. Some of you may remember I think a Senator, Frank Church. And the Church Amendment was one of the first federal refusal clauses, and it allowed physicians to opt out of participating in abortion. And of course, there are laws in Medicare and other federal programs that prohibit any participation in abortion. They prohibit participation in death with dignity. That's why the Veterans Administration, physicians can't participate in the Death with Dignity Act. And here's how these policies also get interpreted. This is a Catholic hospice in Seattle, in the Seattle area. Staff and volunteers may not provide referrals, period. It doesn't say referrals to us, the Compassion and Choices of Washington. It just says no referrals. Expresses an interest in the Death with Dignity Act or an intent to follow through, they're referred to his or her physician. And what happens when the physician's working for a Catholic provider who's not allowed to talk about death with dignity or not allowed to refer? In fact, a few months ago, a hospice patient living in Everett, a man suffering from a brain tumor, asked his hospice social workers and nurses for information about the Death with Dignity Act, and as per Providence's rules, he was referred back to his physician who worked for Providence Hospital in Everett. The physician didn't tell him it wouldn't provide any information. He wasn't aware of Compassion and Choices. He was an elderly man. He didn't have access to the internet, or he didn't have family who were willing to look and do research for him. And so he climbed into his bathtub and he put a rifle in his mouth and he shot his brains out. This is a direct result of being denied information about death with dignity. They also prohibit their hospice nurses and social workers from being present at the time of a death with dignity, when a patient self-administers life-administering medication. And this puts hospice staff in a difficult position. I mean, think about it. If you're a hospice nurse or social worker, you're going on a journey with your patient. From the beginning of the relationship to the end of the relationship. And yet, if your patient chooses to self-administer life-ending medication, you may not be present at the time of death. Nurses and social workers who have been prohibited have told me they feel they have abandoned their patients at the time of death because of these rules. Let's talk about the impacts of these Catholic policies on death with dignity. It's a clear violation of patient autonomy and informed consent. Informed consent is one of the most important principles in the practice of medicine. The American Medical Association makes clear that patients are entitled to informed consent, that withholding referrals is unethical. And the American Medical Association opposes death with dignity and has opposed pretty much everything progressive in the last 100 years, including warning labels on cigarette packages. Abandonment. If you tell a patient, if you can't help the patient, do you think this man who climbed in the bathtub didn't feel abandoned? Of course he was abandoned. He didn't have anyone to turn to for information. Providers are forced to violate professional standards and codes. I talked a little bit about physicians, but social workers have a duty to talk to patients about any legal end-of-life option, not to close down conversation. It violates the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics. It violates their end-of-life policy. It violates policies around nursing. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. I think I mentioned that certain areas of Washington are only served by Catholic providers, and I'll show you a map later. So some of our clients are forced to travel long distances to see the two participating physicians required to qualify for them for the Death with Dignity Act. Death with Dignity process is delayed. And as many of you know who are familiar with hospice, people get into hospice late too. These referrals come late. And with Death with Dignity, it's not like someone shows up with a little black pill. It doesn't work that way. There's a minimum of 15 days between the first and the second oral requests. And for it to be 15 days, you would already have to have 2 participating physicians. So if a person comes to Compassion and Choices and said, we want to use the Death with Dignity Act, if they don't bring the doctors along with them, we have to find the 2 participating physicians. That takes time. So if people are delayed, often they'll die before they can survive the waiting period. Violent suicides, I've already talked about one example of that, and there have been a couple in Washington, and we feel those are tragic and unnecessary. And people feel that an injustice occurs. This is a photo of a woman named Audrey Roll. She's a fairly well-known artist. She lived in Bellingham, Washington until about 2 years ago. Her husband, Norman Shapiro, died very badly while on hospice care. He had a long, drawn-out death, and perhaps he didn't receive intensive palliative care, or he wasn't offered the option of palliative sedation. And he died badly. And after he died, Audrey found out that he had the option of death with dignity, and she was outraged by that. And she met with the director of the hospice and said, why wasn't I provided? Why wasn't Norman given information about this? You know, he didn't ask specifically for death with dignity, but over and over he said, isn't there a way that we can speed this up? I'm done here. My life is over. I'm just lying here waiting to die. Please help me. He was never offered information about the Death with Dignity Act, and it turned into a front page story on the Sunday edition of the Bellingham Herald. And it shamed that hospice into providing information about its policies on death with dignity on the admissions paperwork that they provide. So this is a really serious problem in Washington, because Washington is dominated by 3 very large, very well-capitalized healthcare providers. Providence, Catholic Health Initiatives under the name of Franciscan, which, by the way, is the 4th largest healthcare provider in the United States, and Peace Health. And in recent years, mergers and affiliations between Catholic facilities and secular facilities have been increasing. And when a Catholic facility merges, allies with, or forms an alliance with, or even sells to a secular facility, one of the ethical and religious directives is that the ethical and religious directives must still apply. So when a secular facility merges with a sectarian or non-religious affiliated facility, they're required to adopt the ethical and religious directives. So the expansion of Catholic-controlled healthcare in Washington has been significant. The dark blue counties in this graphic are counties where medical or the hospitals are 100% religiously affiliated. Now, Washington, many of you may not know, but the population of Washington is really around Puget Sound, from its body of water that sort of carves into the northwest portion of the state. There's an old adage in Washington that I learned during the Initiative 1000 campaign, is that on a clear day you can see all the votes you need to pass an initiative from the Space Needle. and that's actually true. You get enough of the vote, you can win, because Eastern Washington is primarily unpopulated. There's not a whole lot there. But look how the Catholic institutions or controlled institutions are sort of taking over in Washington. We're already at a point where nearly 50% of the Catholic or acute care hospital beds are controlled by Catholic entities. So this is a serious development. So the next two slides are resources, and it's my understanding that you'll have access to these programs once they're posted online, or if you got our brochure, I would be happy to send you a copy of this presentation with these resources listed as a PDF document attached, so that you don't even have to have PowerPoint to look at it. So obviously we're listed. Merger Watch, a national organization that's really paying close attention to what's happening nationally. And this isn't just a problem in Washington, this is happening nationally. Hospital mergers are really happening as a result of economic factors that are driving the expansion of medical care providers to join, to improve efficiencies as a result of the Affordable Care Act. There are a lot of complex factors that are contributing to these mergers, but they are happening, they'll continue to happen, and Merger Watch is paying close attention when they happen with Catholic facilities. The ethical and religious directives, again, interesting reading. You know, one of the things that any of you who are considering an initiative or legislation in your own state, know your enemy. And remember that there is only one real enemy to death with dignity legislation and initiatives in the United States, according to Eli Stutzman. Again, it's the Catholic Church. The ACLU of Washington has a real nice webpage with a lot of good information. And there's also another Washington organization called Catholic Watch. Now, I am not here to Catholic bash. In Washington State, Catholic providers have been leaders in palliative care. Franciscan was one of the early leaders in the movement to improve palliative care in the entire United States. Providence and other providers have been very active in the Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment program. I think maybe some of you heard that mentioned in one presentation. This is a non-hospital medical order that allows you to decline treatment, such as CPR or medically assisted nutrition and hydration. They've been very active and supportive of the POLS program. I know many and work with many clinicians who work for these organizations who don't agree with their employers' policies, including social workers and nurses who simply disregard their rules and refer to compassionate choices or provide information, and even at the threat of losing their jobs. So There are many good people working in these organizations, and these organizations have done a lot of good things in the communities in Washington. When it comes to death with dignity, though they truly fall short. That's all I have to present. I think I've just about nailed it.
This is a very serious issue, as it's not just in Washington State. It is nationally that the moneyed Catholic churches pour that into the hospitals that are then taking over other hospitals that aren't able to survive in the system that we have here in the state. So it's a very big issue. We have an important announcement. Excuse me.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. I wanted to make a quick announcement. When we go outside, it is not safe for us to wear anything that distinguishes us with Final Exit Network or any of your badges, anything that has anything to do with the movement. The police have advised us to please not wear anything outside. We've had someone unsuccessfully try to be violent, and so please be safe tonight and do not wear anything that could attach us to this.
Need the badges at the...
Keep them with you, you know. These are gold. Well, you need your ticket.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so thank you.
We only need our tickets, what you're saying at the golf.
Right. And you're safe. The police are here and everything's good. But
It's rather useful to have your badges as well, though, at the dinner, in case you don't know everybody yet.
Yeah. So I will repeat your questions. I promise. Every single one of them. The woman with the white hair.
Is there any progress with the advent of the new pope, that some of these things might be loosened a little, because he's a cool guy in some areas?
Great. So the question was there any hope with the new pope? That things will loosen up a little bit. Well, the new pope is certainly showing, I think, a new level of compassion, focusing the priorities of the church in areas where maybe they hadn't been focused on before. But as I mentioned before, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops was appointed by this pope's predecessor. And in some ways, they're like an appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court. They're there for life. And they will be there for the remainder of many of our lifetimes. So if change comes, change will come very slowly. And by slowly, I mean decades. I'm sorry to say. Yes, sir.
There's yesterday's New York Times and yesterday's Wall Street Journal had an article about a 500-page report coming out of the Health and Human Services Department to focus on end-of-life discussions and care that was going to be covered by Medicare and Medicaid. And the conclusions were clear that they wanted to have those discussions between the doctor and patient covered by Medicare. And that 500-page report supposedly had a number of very positive, favorable recommendations about how to handle end-of-life care, end-of-life discussions. But my question is two-part. First of all, I'd like your comments on that. And second of all, I'd like some idea from you as an activist in Washington, what the rest of us can or should be doing to support our movement in terms of writing letters to congressmen and state legislators and health and human services departments, et cetera, as far as your recommendations to what the most effective means of activism might be.
Right, so I'll try and summarize that question for you. It was, there's a new report, a very long report, which I haven't had an opportunity to read yet. It just came out There was a story in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and in that report it recommended that these conversations between physicians and patients about end-of-life choices were essential. And they were essential toward preserving the reserves of Medicare, especially with this aging population. And then the second part of the question was related to, what can we do around this issue? What can we do to help encourage progress in the area of end-of-life care? If I've done that justice to that. So I haven't read this report yet, but virtually every right-thinking organization was in favor of including in the Affordable Care Act that Obama proposed and was eventually enacted, a provision that reimbursed physicians for a conversation with patients once every 5 years about their end-of-life wishes. So currently, physicians are not reimbursed for having these conversations. They do them, and they often bill under some other code or something like that. But if they could bill for them, it would happen more frequently. That was derailed by conservatives, led by a woman from Alaska, who will remain unnamed, because I don't want to give her any publicity. But recently, the conversation is recurring, and it looks like that provision is going to be enacted by regulation. And so it may actually come to be. And so I think that that's essential. And I think it's essential for individuals, organizations to question politicians, educate politicians about this issue, make sure they understand your priorities around end of life, around advanced planning, around honoring patients' choices. I mean, it's very important to educate, to talk about this, to make your representatives understand your wishes. Run for office, send letters, write an op-ed, join an organization that's advocating for change, and finally, support those organizations financially that are actually doing the work. The Deaf and Dignity National Center, Compassion and Choices of Washington, and if you believe in patient choice and you believe in the Final Exit Network, that organization as well. They're less politically engaged, I think, than the Deaf and Dignity National Center, Compassion and Choices of Washington, but still a positive force.
Thank you, Rob. I know Rob would be happy to answer more questions, and I'm afraid they'll have to be individual. I thank you for very informative. I learned quite a bit. I also learned that what you talked about, redemptive suffering, is sort of like the good things that sadists do to masochists.
The alternative had been a prolonged painful death from prostate cancer. Now, Marshall Perrin, the Chief Minister for the Northern Territory of Australia, and his Parliament have given Bob this legal choice between two ways of dying, one painful and one not. A few months prior to that, Dr. Chris Waite from the Northern Territory AMA and a Reverend gentleman unsuccessfully sought an injunction in the Northern Territory Supreme Court, then proceeded to the full court of the Supreme Court and ultimately the High Court to try and stop this proclamation of the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act. Unsuccessfully. Now we go on to March 27, 1997, and we have another yes. This time, federal MP Kevin Andrews' Euthanasia Laws Bill to overturn the right of the Northern Territory to retain the so-called Roti Act. Was passed by 38 to 33. effectively putting the Northern Territory and indeed the rest of Australia back into the previous century. So how was this achieved? Michael Gordon, the political editor of The Australian, in his article in 1997, Holy Alliance, had this to say. New South Wales had emerged as the state most likely to follow Northern Territory legislation. And so doctors, right-to-lifers, nurses and others concerned with palliative care, some state MPs and others who had written articles against PE met to form a group called Euthanasia No. Included, as you would expect, was a guy who had strong connections with Cardinal Clancy of the Catholic Church, and a guy called John O. Johnson, another Catholic with extremely conservative views on social issues ranging from divorce and censorship to abortion and euthanasia. And we have an interesting coalition, the Labor hack, Tony Burke, joined forces with Kevin Andrews, who's a high-profile member of what's called the Lions Forum, a socially conservative grouping of Liberal MPs. And this network, according to Gordon, would become one of the most effective political campaigns in recent Australian political history. To quote, having a profile so low as to be almost subterranean was an integral part of the strategy. All of the principles were Catholics. It is a case study in the art of persuasion, with subtlety rather than intimidation and coercion being the secret of its success. The group concentrated on the slippery slope argument that voluntary euthanasia would lead to non-voluntary and then involuntary, and the use of the words lethal injection. They were successful, and with the insufficient support for euthanasia in the New South Wales Parliament, Euthanasia No was about to wind up. And then we go over to the national capital, Canberra. The office of the then Prime Minister had advised that the Northern Territory legislation was within the power of the Northern Territory and not a matter for disallowance. However, there was a change of government, and the new Prime Minister, John Howard, who was a conservative Christian, told a meeting that he was personally strongly opposed to euthanasia, and Kevin Andrews took up the challenge to overturn the Northern Territory legislation. The campaign was focused on the Senate committee inquiry to examine Andrews' bill. The strategy was to encourage anyone who opposed euthanasia, including the Aboriginal and disability groups and palliative care organisations, to make a submission. A record of more than 12,000 submissions that were generated, with 93% of them either supporting Andrews' bill or opposing euthanasia. The Senate inquiry was clearly hijacked by those opposing. For instance, one of the four specific areas of inquiry was the desirability of the enactment of the provisions. And this original brief in the report became the more general moral, ethical and social arguments about euthanasia. I just can't help but compare this with Veronique's Quebec inquiry. Opponents of voluntary euthanasia, as we would expect, had arguments based on the sanctity of life, religious beliefs, the impact of the old, the vulnerable and disabled, the slippery slope, deterioration of social standards and the erosion of medical ethics. The committee decided these had priority over individual rights, autonomy and freedom of choice, and concluded that laws relating to euthanasia are unwise and dangerous public policy. In a comment on the evidence, two senators disagreed, and they said that some church leaders had compared Nazi atrocities with the Rights to the Terminal Act in the Northern Territory, as did Archbishop Hickey and others others in what they call historical submissions. So I turn to the encyclical of Pope John Paul on abortion and euthanasia for a bit of background on this religious opposition. It's a lengthy document, but here are a few gleanings. The murder of Abel by Cain, the first biblical murder, is somehow twisted into a reason why a terminally ill person should not make use of an assisted death. And I found it very hard to credit that a person such as Chantal, pleading for help to die, would gain much comfort from contemplating on Cain. Now, John Paul II says that, here's some of Bob's talk coming out again. I confirm that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law of God, since it is the deliberate and morally unacceptable killing of a human person. This doctrine is based on the natural law and upon the written word of God. And the natural law is written in the human heart, and it's an obligatory point of reference for civil law itself. Now, I'm no authority on what constitutes natural law, but there does seem to be some inconsistency here. For example, a US Supreme Court decision in 1837 determined that a woman could not become a qualified lawyer because the paramount destiny and mission of the woman was to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. And this is the law of the Creator. And the rules of civil society must be adapted to the general constitution of things and cannot be based upon exceptional cases. Now, those who believe in a paternalistic interventionist God could also believe that God does and can cause earthquakes and floods. Natural and divine law seen as one. As a result of earthquakes, buildings fall down according to the law of nature, gravity, often killing many people. Yet A.C. Graham's view of nature and natural law is that it's not related to the supernatural. Confusing, isn't it? The encyclical states that suicide is always morally objectionable as murder. It's a grave sin. But even this is complex when you think it through. If a person knows and has been clearly and reliably informed that by taking a certain action and by following a certain path, this will certainly result in their death, and yet they persist in doing this action and die, that would reasonably be deemed suicide. Yet Jesus did just this by travelling the road to Jerusalem to his crucifixion. What's more, he did it at the command of his Father. As others more theologically qualified than I have pointed out, surely the ultimate in child abuse. Add the factor of the Holy Trinity, and it becomes even more complicated. I'd just like to touch on one other aspect of this encyclical, that's suffering. We read that the Pope praises a person who forgoes painkillers, causing it heroic behaviour, and saying that suffering, while an evil and trial in itself, can always be a source of good. To say that neither suffering is heroic, many would find patronising or offensive, as I do. Most thinking people would find it impossible to equate extreme suffering with the concept of a loving and compassionate God. My unnamed fan here is an exception. A rather poetical vision of Dante's hell rather than biblical. I won't. And I've got that in my files. Actually, we've received very few really anti-tests like that. There seems to be very little in the encyclical in true empathy for the suffering of individuals. So church dogma and selected biblical quotes take preference. So how does this translate into the nitty-gritty of current church opposition to compassionate choice and assisted dying in Australia? The New South Wales member of the Legislative Council, Kate Feynman, said in 2013, prior to debate on her rights to determine ill bill, she expected a repeat of the forceful campaigning of the Catholic Labour right and the Catholic Church has seen in other states. And another fellow MP, John Kay, said during the debate on this bill, some objections are emerging from a purely dogmatic, narrow point of view. Many of the arguments are relied on misleading and downright mendacious tactics, and no more than Cardinal George Pell, in his letter of the 8th of May on behalf of the Catholic Bishops of New South Wales. The letter contains 4 substantial lies. It is a deliberate attempt by the Cardinal to mislead the people of New South Wales and in particular his flock. Cardinal Pell states that despite talk of a dignified death, dignity is not served by telling the old and dying through our laws that they will be better off dead. And we would be better off if they were dead. And that wasn't in any way part of the bill. Now, the Anglican Synod of Sydney in 2010 expressed opposition along predictable lines. They state that palliative care was sufficient except for the tiny minority, but had no empathy for that minority. They alleged that legislation would lead to patient mistrust, creeping expansion, reduced funding for PC, and that most supporters for euthanasia were young and healthy, none of which is supported by data. In an explanation of Parliament in May 2013, Kate Feynman again said, in an explanation, Dr. Catherine Lennon attended the briefing that I held for members on my rights to determine ill bill. She had not been invited in her own right, although that's how she identified herself. After she left the briefing, Dr. Lennon made 2 telephone calls to the Australasian College of Emergency Medicine to complain that Dr. Lee, who had been at the presentation, made a statement to the effect that all emergency specialists are trained in euthanasia. Obviously, that's a complete lie. What she didn't explain to Parliament was that she was the founder and board member, along with her husband, of Maker Care Australia, a non-profit Catholic organisation that specifically enjoins medical professionals to act as prophetic witnesses by reflecting on the teaching and practice of contemporary medical care in the light of the gospel and its values most recently presented in the encyclical. She gave the impression that in Oregon, patients were being euthanized because they were simply depressed. Also from Cape, Reverend Fred Nile, another member of the Legislative Council, quotes from an article by Peter Saunders, and he says there's a stunning 4,620% increase in Belgian euthanasia cases in the 10 years since legislation. Obviously wrong. New South Wales Premier lashed out at Cardinal Pell again for denouncing Catholic politicians who do not follow the Church's teaching on gay marriage and euthanasia. Some of you might be aware that Cardinal Pell has been promoted to the Vatican now to work out the finances for the Vatican. We have the Liberal member for the same Parliament, David Clark, also known as an overstay cooperator, agreeing with the Cardinal, saying you can't just use your religion when you want to. The Australian Christian Lobby is a sort of opposing group to ours, and he commented, I'm worried about the effect of sick and elderly and vulnerable people. You cannot produce a safe euthanasia law. Where it has been introduced, euthanasia and assisted suicide, whatever safeguards are in place, they have always been circumvented. We have instances overseas where not just dozens, but hundreds and sometimes thousands of patients are being killed by their doctors without request for euthanasia or any explicit consent given. Really? Move on to other more recently defeated bills in Australia. As been said earlier in this conference, there have been many bills, some of them very close. The South Australian Greens LLC Terry Franks in 2010 said that the defeat followed a highly organised campaign by Conservatives working along party, religious and state lines. In the same parliament, religious-based Family First Party in debate incorrectly stated that the Washington State DWD referendum was passed with a 46% vote in its efforts to denigrate public support for assisted dying. And in Victoria, the Speaker, Ken Smith, quoted as saying that political debate on euthanasia has been retarded by religious fanaticism.
2 minutes, please.
2, okay, I'll better head on a bit. I'm getting there. I'll go on to the next one. How far will our religious opposition go? I'll let you read it. Our friends Alex Schadenberg, I think you recognise that name, and they managed to manipulate the poll. Paul Russell happens to be not only the director of No Euthanasia, but a Catholic. In Tasmania, we've had a similar problem, but not so much with the Catholics there, actually. It's the Anglican bishop there used similar arguments to Cardinal Perdue Sydney, and this bill was very close. It was defeated by 9 votes to 11 after the Speaker absented himself from the chair so that he could vote against it. 2 other points. In this Tasmanian bill, another conservative fundamentalist Christian was guilty of blatant misrepresentation of the facts. For example, she said the Oregon 2013 report indicates that being a burden on family, friends and caregivers is the major reason for requesting assisted suicide for 38.6% of those who have died versus 23.5% for inadequate pain control. Of course, what she didn't quote was the 3 major reasons: loss of autonomy, decreasing ability to participate, and loss of dignity. It seems that nothing is beyond the religious right to block reform so desperately needed by the vast majority of the community. Their tactics often include lying and deception, yet they seem to get away with it time and time again. Very similar to what's happening worldwide, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Are there questions?
I have one question. The Catholic Church apparently does not oppose palliative sedation. How does that square with their prohibition again? I mean, their desire for, I can't remember what the previous speaker said, conscious dying. Even if you're in pain, they want you to stay conscious. So redemptive dying or something like that. I don't get how they can say one thing and allow palliative sedation.
Well, I don't get it either. One of the questions that I've asked at quite a few meetings, if a person is in such a state of health that they require palliative sedation, how many of them would prefer the option of palliative sedation and taking some time to die, even if they're in a coma, or being able to say, give me a big dose now, get it over and done with? To me, it's just totally, well, it's inexplicable. Rightly might be able to say why.
Well, the Catholic justification for terminal or palliative sedation is based on the Thomas Aquinas' doctrine of double effect.
Yes.
And the doctrine of double effect is a complex piece of sophistry, but essentially it says that if your intention is to relieve suffering, then if you actually are hastening death, as long as it is your intention to relieve suffering, that is sufficient justification. You are not committing a sinful act. Many Catholics would say that is bull dust, and many ethicists say that that's a very dubious proposition. And Roger Hunt, who's a palliative care physician in Australia, says that if it wasn't clear that death was being hastened, there was no need to justify the terminal sedation by the doctrine of double effect. So it's all a load of crap.
Essentially, you can give the same medication, and provided you say that it's to relieve the pain, it's okay. But if you said that you were helping to hasten the person's death with the same medication, you'd be liable.
Thank you. Thanks again. And Sean? Sean Davison. Most of you know that because Sean presented yesterday about his situation when he was prosecuted and persecuted, I believe, in Australia, in New Zealand, for the death of his mother. Sean lives in Cape Town now, and had the distinct privilege, I would say, to be supported by Desmond Tutu. And he is going to share with us now an interview that I'm sure will be a message we will enjoy. Thank you, Sean.
because he's obviously supporting the issue. And I said, no, Faye, I can't do that. Invite Desmond Tutu to the conference. And she said, of course you can, Sean, invite him. So I sent him an email and I said, can you come to the conference? And he said, I would love to come. Unfortunately, I've got another engagement in Norway and I can't come. I told Faye, and she emailed back and said, look, why don't you ask Desmond Tutu to do a welcome video for the conference? And I said to Faye, no, I can't possibly ask him to do that. But sure enough, I tried, and immediately he said, yes, indeed. Desmond Tutu agreed to give a brief welcome to the conference. Desmond Tutu, though, is surrounded by kind of gatekeepers that watch him, because so many people want to talk to him. And anyway, what we had is a short interview. It's only about less than 10 minutes. It's only saying what he said in his article in the Observer 2 months ago. Yeah, as you would have read in that article, he expressed the fact that he had changed his way of thinking. Previously, he had been focusing on issues relating to the living. And only now he was applying his mind to the dying. This is the consequences of both myself and Helena Dolney. She's our chairperson in the front row. Wave again, Helena. We both got an ear to Desmond Tutu, and through several meetings, we kept raising the issues about death and dying. Obviously, Desmond Tutu knew my story after he'd written to the court to get a lenient sentence. Helena Dolney, her husband, she's a widow, was a man called Joe Slovo, one of the leading architects in the freedom struggle in South Africa. His name is mentioned along Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. Very, very famous leader in the country. So Helena had an ear to Desmond Tutu and also began talking to him about these issues. And now he's applied his mind to the issues around dying, which has helped our campaign a great deal, leading to this article in the Observer, and now, for the first time, he spoke on video, basically saying the same things. I can start telling some jokes now, don't I? Oh, you know what, also, that lady who came in before, who warned us about the protesters.
It's me.
Oh, yeah, protesters.
We're going to make fun of him right here.
No, we're warned about the dangers of going outside. I spent about an hour this morning talking to the people out there, one by one, in their wheelchairs, and they were so appreciative, polite, and courteous that somebody had my name tag on, came out and talked to them. They just wanted to be heard. They'd come from all over the States. Some had come from Canada, one had come from Mexico. So I don't think there's a real threat. Of course, one person.
It's not them that's the threat.
Not them, okay, there are other people hiding there. There might be a threat. But I had a great hour out there this morning as well. And apparently somebody came up, Julia Halloway came to me and said, a man had broken through the security and come upstairs looking for the man from South Africa to come back down and talk to them.
Well, I think you make a good point, because I think really one of the issues is opening up dying. And that's what I keep saying all the time in France, is if we think that we have the God-given truth, excuse me for the term, then we're just going to get into problems. If we accept that others have real concerns and we talk to them about them, then we find that we have common ground. And then we can really have a discussion and move them to our position while leaving the others as extremists.
I think they're going to be more aggro if we are here and they are there and there's no interaction.
Absolutely.
They were so happy interacting, they were so polite to me. Remember, I wanted to tell their story. So I'm going to go down there tomorrow looking forward to it. It's one of the highlights of the conference for me. Going to chat to these people. Look, I think we might not be able to get this to run now, but tomorrow morning, Carol Sweeney and I are talking at 9 o'clock. An uncivilized hour for both of us. We're both Kiwis in origin. But what we'll do, if Carol doesn't mind, show that interview at the end of that talk. I think there's going to be plenty of time in that. Don't worry, there'll probably be more people in the morning anyway. We might like to see.
You have the file, you will get my computer.
Look, it's so late now.